Good morning, church. I grew up skiing in Australia. We do not have powder snow in Australia. It is groomed runs only. A few years ago, a storm was heading towards Mammoth, so my brother was visiting. We headed up to chase the powder. We went to the top of the lift, skiing down. I was feeling confident. I was feeling excited. I'd seen the clips on Instagram of people flying through the powder. On my right, there was a bank about waist high. I'd learned to ski in the front of my boot. Nobody had told me that when you hit the powder, you need to keep the tips of your skis up and lean back a little. The change in momentum was truly shocking. As my skis dropped and got ripped from the bottom of my feet, I went head first. And it was just quite shocking how stuck I was. It was one of those moments where you feel like this just might be your new situation forever. I wasn't so stuck that I couldn't hear my brother laughing at me, but I just didn't know what to do next. I found myself trying to get out. I felt completely and utterly stuck. Eventually got myself out. Have you ever felt stuck in your life ever? Have you ever found yourself up against an obstacle that is so large it feels like it'll never move? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you find yourself asking yourself, listen, I don't know what to do next, and I'm not sure if there is anything I can do. I feel resolutely stuck. Perhaps it's a marriage. I mean, you made the decisions with the information that you had at the age that you were. But now, many years later, it's abundantly clear it's just never going to be a great relationship. And you've got certain principles that you want to stick by, but you're stuck and you don't know what to do. You come home every evening and you're not sure which one of the 7 dwarfs your husband is going to be when you open the door, whether it's grumpy or happy or dopey, you don't know. Perhaps it was a diagnosis. You went through the procedures of care and you sat before a doctor and they said, this is permanent. This is lifelong. And you now find yourself in that position, you don't know what to do with it. Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe you've been living for 15 years sober, but every morning you still have to wake up and fight the battle to stay sober. And you're wondering when that addiction and that fight will stop, but it just seems like it's going to go on forever. Or maybe you're not winning the fight and you feel like you've been having the same fight day in, day out for the past 20 years. And you feel stuck. You trained for a certain position, you took out loans, and now you're working in a job you do not like. Maybe there's a part of your soul. Maybe it's the anxiety that has been running and you've been through treatment and counseling, but it just will not stop. And you feel stuck. So what do you do? What do you do when you feel like there is nothing you can do? One thing we usually do is we do the comparisons, don't we? We say, listen, that person over there, I want their health. I want their income. That's what I want. And then in those comparisons, we go back to Jesus because we need somebody to blame for this. And we say, God, what's going on? Seriously, why is my life like this? And we go to God and we have those angry prayers. You know those prayers when you pray them and you're so angry at God, you tell God that God doesn't exist, but you still need somebody to be angry at, so God has to take your anger as well as you telling him that he doesn't exist. We're smart like that, we are. It's easy to come to the conclusion, after you've prayed those prayers repeatedly, maybe Jesus just doesn't care for me. You've had that moment when you're driving to work and you're repeating this prayer for this obstacle in your life to be moved, and you've stopped halfway through because you've prayed it so many times and you're like, I'm just not going to bother again. What do you do? My question is simply this. I don't know what you're facing in your life. Emotional, relational, physical, spiritual. I don't know what you're facing in your life, but is there a chance that even in your suffering, in your weakness, in your despair, God still deeply cares for you? The Apostle Paul, he was a man of great faith. He was a man who had more faith than all of us combined in this room, okay? He was a man who had seen miracles. He was a man who had prayed for miracles and they had occurred. He was a man who wrote most of the New Testament. And yet we find him writing in 2 Corinthians. There was sent, therefore, a thorn in my flesh to torment me. It felt like it was a messenger from Satan. It hurt like hell is the language we could use today. And 3 times I went to the Lord and said, God, please take this away from me. We don't know what the thorn in Paul's flesh was. People have speculated. Some people have said, listen, it seems to be his eyesight. In Galatians, he says, see how I'm writing with such large letters. Perhaps he was going blind. Others said it was potentially the consequences of the way in which he'd been beaten almost to death on a few occasions. Some suggest it was epilepsy, living with epilepsy in those days and times when they didn't have the technical language and the diagnostic language for it. Others say it was the fact that he didn't consider himself eloquent. They called him a babbler when he stood in the Roman squares. He was embarrassed. Perhaps it was also those opponents that he writes so frequently of. What I find is interesting is Luther and Calvin do not let Paul off so easily. They say it was a moral, spiritual problem. Because in the very chapter before this, he writes, am I not one who is still weak? Am I not one who inwardly burns? We don't know what this problem is. But we do know, in the words of Andy Stanley, it was permanent, it was debilitating, and it was humiliating. And it wasn't going anywhere. And so Paul comes and he prays 3 times. I don't want this. I don't want this in my life. God, take it away. And God doesn't. Instead, God responds with this. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Here's the thing, Paul, you went through the school of Gamaliel, the greatest rabbi in all of Jerusalem. You received instruction from him, but Paul, there is instruction that you still yet need to receive, and I cannot take this away from you because it came from the devil, but it has a purpose. And I know that's a dangerous thing to say. But Paul, listen, have you noticed in this world how the arrogant, the prideful, the self-righteous, the people who think they have it all together, have you noticed how consistently mean they are to other people? Whereas those who are weak, those who receive grace, those who are lowly, those who are humble of heart, as Jesus says, they are kind to others. See, here's the thing, Paul. I need you to understand that it is okay to receive grace. And it is okay to be weak, because when you recognize those things in yourself, you are more likely to be kind and gracious to others. You are more likely to forgive them. You are more likely to recognize their weakness and help them in their weakness. Paul, I can't change this. It has a purpose. Tom Radulius grew up in a family without faith, but a beautiful and a close and a thoughtful family. He went off to the highest institutions of education that this country has. He first went to Yale, there with his twin brother. In his dorm room, there was an individual there who was a Christian, and he began discussions with his new friend. And he says, listen, I found that the claims of Christianity seem to have more credibility than I had previously thought. Paul Redulius and his twin brother began investigating Christianity. They began attending church. If I can have the slide up, he continued on to go to Harvard, where he got a PhD in maths and physics. But the other thing that I love about Paul is this. He wanted to join the CIA, which I think is, from a childhood dream, he wanted to be a spy. And I love that, and I relate to that completely. Honestly, it's an incredible dream. I would love to be a spy. I honestly would. And so if you'd forgive me a moment, just a moment, because I know the CIA is watching this, okay? I know they're watching. Listen, I'm in, okay? I want to help, okay? Send the black SUV at 5 a.m. I'll be out the front of my house because you know where I live with my bags packed. I will still need to maintain my cover ID, so I will still work here as your pastor, and you'll never know whether I'm a spy or not, but I want in, okay? Give me a shot at this. Tom Redulius. He had investigated the claims of Christianity, but he had never felt its need in his life, until he went through the application process to become an agent for the CIA. This is what he says. The day of my first polygraph is the day I came to faith. See, as a part of becoming a member of the CIA, you have to go through the lie detector test. And as he went through that test, he realized that he is not the person that he thought he was. He wasn't a bad person, but he realized he'd stolen fruit from the cafeteria, that he'd illegally downloaded music, that he had lied to his mother. And in that moment, he recognized his need of grace. He goes on to say, listen, I realized it wasn't just the drug dealers and the murderers and the corrupt politicians who need mercy. I too am in need of God's mercy. And in that moment, it's not that the claims of Christianity had changed, but he knew in his heart the God that he needed. And he came to faith during a polygraph test for the CIA. But I love what he goes on to say. He says, listen, in recognizing that I was a person who needed mercy, that helped me treat others with mercy. In recognizing that I was a person of weakness, that allowed me to be kind to other people's weakness. So Paul, we're not taking this thorn away. I need you to be a person who recognizes that they need grace. It's okay to receive grace, and it's okay to be weak because that will make you kinder to others. So then Paul takes that, and he says, and I know it's only a short sentence, but I think it has incredible power. He says, therefore I will. That's always the question, isn't it? What will I do next? Therefore I will. What comes next? I recognize my suffering. I recognize my weakness. I recognize that I am stuck. What do I do now? It's so easy to be tempted just to quit and retreat and give up. Paul says, I will go forward. Paul essentially says this, I will go forward and I will find the next right thing to do. It's tempting to quit and start again elsewhere. But no, I will find the next right thing to do and go forward. The best example I have of this comes from the life of Dusrath Munji. In 1959, he is there working as a laborer in India, in the field. This field is flanked by a mountain range, a large mountain range with dangerous trails. His wife is bringing him lunch, and she slips off the trail on the side of the mountain, suffers injuries, and passes away. He has a family and children. He is heartbroken. The only way to get to medical care was to walk around this mountain range, a journey of 90 kilometers. And you can do the math. They have the funeral. After the funeral, he takes his chisel and his hammer, and he goes and he starts hammering at the mountain. The villagers They figure he's just taking it personally. He's getting his revenge on the mountain. They see it as an act of grief. Next day, though, after working in the fields, he goes and he starts working again. See, he's worked out that if he can carve a safe path through the mountains, his village will only be 5 kilometers away from medical care. He has a wound, it hurt, but now he's going to do the next right thing. So he hit and carved and chipped at this mountain for 22 years. Grab the slide there. He carved that out by hand. By hand. It's over 10 meters deep, 100 meters wide through solid rock. The rest of the villagers said, "Listen, you're mad." And he said, "That only steeled my resolve even more." Here's the thing. He lost something deep and precious to him, his wife. But instead of stopping in that moment, he said, "I will therefore find the next right thing and simply do it." And he spent 22 years carving at that. That is love. That is commitment. That is beautiful. I love it. My teenagers will be very proud for me in this moment. I am basically quoting Kristen Bell from Frozen 2. "I don't know what you're going through, but find the next right thing and do it." Paul says, "I will therefore." So what's he do? Well, he goes on to say something that is quite shocking and confusing. He says this, "I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. When I am weak, I am strong." Church, that's a strange thing to say, isn't it? I delight. I delight in hardships. Dostoevsky grew up just outside of St. Petersburg. His father was an incredibly generous surgeon who ran a charitable hospital. Dostoevsky, as a young boy, would be attending surgeries and learnt much from his experiences there. A brilliant man. In his youth, though, he ran into trouble, began drinking and gambling, problems that would stick with him throughout his life. He found some friends which the Russian government considered dissidents, and they were rounded up. And he was sentenced to death by the firing squad. There he was, tied to the stake, with the weapons pointed at him, expecting his demise. And a horse came up. A horse came up and intervened. At the last moment, it had been repealed. Instead, he was sent to 4 years of hard work in Siberia. He went and did his time there. He nearly passed away. We nearly lost one of the greatest minds in Christian thought. But when he came back, he started writing. And he wrote books that are complex and in some cases dark and violent, but incredibly compassionate. After writing The Brothers of Karamazov, he moved on, and eventually he wrote a book titled The Idiot. And the book begins at his position there in front of the firing squad. That's where the book takes off. I like Alain de Botton's summary of this position, if I can have that up there on the screen. Dostoevsky notices the gilded spire of a nearby church and how it glitters in the sun. He'd never before realized how entrancing a glint of sunlight could be. And he is filled with an immense, deep love of this world. You might see a beggar, he says, and think how you would love to change places with them so as to be able to simply continue to breathe the air and feel the wind and merely to exist. Because existence at that point seems something, at this moment of final revelation, something so infinitely precious. He goes on. He says, listen, then you discover that the revised order comes through, and your life is not over at all. Dostoevsky, in his book, asks this question: what would it be like to go through one's whole life in such a state of gratitude and generosity. You wouldn't share any of the normal attitudes. He goes on, you'd love everyone equally. You'd be enchanted by the simplest things. You'd never feel angry or frightened. You would seem to be, to other people, a kind of an idiot. Hence the title of Dostoevsky's book. It's an incredible insight. And I say this, church, and I say it carefully, perhaps in your suffering, in your moment, in what you are stuck with, the thorn in your flesh, there could yet be a strange gift in it. Dostoevsky, he is committed to this position where he is vulnerable, and yet in that moment there is this strange gift for him. He says, listen, existence is beautiful enough as it is. Shouldn't that be at some points just enough reason to be grateful? The simple ability to see and think that we live in a life filled with striving and failing and success and deadlines. Do not miss the moment of just sheer beauty that comes with recognizing the fact that you exist. You're alive. That should be enough. And in that moment, in that strange gift that he receives, he lives his life from then on as what people consider an idiot. Because the confusions of this world, they don't stop him. I give you this illustration because what Paul says, it's bizarre. I will boast gladly about my weaknesses. This is not a normal response, church. So that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul has found something so infinitely precious, the persecution of this life. It doesn't matter. Let me give you two illustrations of this. Paul lived in a time when it was the orators who would stand in the Roman squares, eloquent. They would there argue, they would perform plays. The Roman squares was the place where everyone's attention was centered. It had the sway of society. People would stand there and perform brilliant speeches. And here comes Paul, a stammering, stuttering, blind, short rabbi, scarred to near in recognition because of his beatings. And here Paul comes and he stands in these centers and he begins to profess the goodness of God. And Paul delights in his weaknesses. He delights in his trials. He delights in his adversities. Why? Because when the Roman Empire comes to faith, everyone's going to know it wasn't because of him. When somebody is weak, comes with a message that is powerful, people recognize that it wasn't the messenger, it is the message. And so for Paul, he is not afraid to say, I am weak, I need grace, I am a person who is beset by problems, but in my weakness, God is strong. God's grace is sufficient for me. I am tired of scrolling through Instagram and seeing fitness influencers standing there without their shirts on, telling you how you can have a perfect life like theirs if you just follow their plan and buy up to their subscription and diet. I'm tired of influencers saying, hey, listen, if you wake up at 4 a.m. and read a book by 5 a.m. and do 1,000 sit-ups by 6 a.m., you'll be a millionaire by 7 a.m. I'm just tired of it. There is nothing wrong with self-improvement, church, but that's not the message that this world needs. I don't want to preach a message like that. I think there is one message. There is one message that the world needs to hear. God has sufficient grace for all of your mistakes. God has enough grace for your greatest mistakes. And God's strength is strong enough to get you through your deepest weaknesses. That is a message I can boast in. That is a message I am proud of. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. I will boast of that God. I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what the thorn is in your side. But church, the thorn in your side is nothing compared to the power of God.